This evening, we'll be looking at the Kenyan protests that happened recently. I've got Joan Wahiga, a Kenyan, who is based here in Canada and Kenya. And she was in Kenya during the protests. Good evening, Jo. How are you?
Hi, good evening. I am very well, thank you. Thanks
Well,
for having me.
welcome to the podcast. Now, in terms of what happened, can you give us some historical context of the protests, past youth-led movements in Kenya, and how they relate to the recent or the June protests?
So I think in Kenya, there's a long history of movements, both youth-led and otherwise. The fight for independence, is the start of our country. Very famously, we have Tom Mboya, who's a well-known political figure in Kenya, and he was a minister, I think, by the time he was around 25 or 26. Okay. After that, in 1982, there was an attempted coup in Kenya. There were some protests after that. I'm not sure if they were youth-led or not. I know that in 1991, there was a wave of protests across the country, protesting for multi-party rule, because at that time in Kenya, there was one ruling party. In 1992, there's protests by the mothers of political prisoners. So those were not youth-led, but those are very, very famous protests. Yes. Professor Wangari Maathai, who later won a Nobel Peace Prize, was part of those protests, along with the mothers and I believe grandmothers of young men who had been held political prisoner by the regime at the time. So that's just like a very quick and dirty overview. It's a summary. I mean, there's more after that as well, but we can get into that later.
So, from what you've mentioned, there have always been some kind of protests in Kenya.
Yeah.
Is there any connection with the recent waves of activism?
I mean, I would say there's, the connection would be that people know that going out to the streets to protest is a viable option to advocate for change in Kenya. Yes. I think one of the things that's very interesting about this particular wave of protests is that they were quite organic. I think especially since 2007, when there were protests after a contested election. Protests have usually been called by a member of a political party or like members of the opposition. And, they say, hey, by the way, we should take our grievances to the streets. But the protests in June of this year were organic. There's no politician who was asking or advocating for people to go out to the streets. This is something that people decided to do organically.
And what were the causes? What triggered the protests?
So the very specific trigger was the Financial Bill 2024. I would say if there is discontent that has been building up over the recent past in Kenya, even before the finance bill was brought to the public attention, there were doctors were protesting in Kenya because intern salaries were going to be reduced, and they were going to be drastically reduced. So doctors had been on strike, and I think ordinary Kenyans were very much in support of them because we understand all of the challenges we already face with our healthcare system. So I think just in April or May, the doctors had already been out protesting. So when we started getting news about this financial bill, it really just triggered this outrage. I know the dominant narrative has been very much that these are youth-led protests, and I kind of wanted to expand or complicate that narrative a little bit. Because the truth is, I think, as someone who was home and who was on social media at the time, the people who were sounding the alarm about this finance bill were actually professionals. It was like professionals and professional associations. It was lawyers who were like going through the bill and looking at the contents and saying, this doesn't seem right, you know. It was like people who work in insurance. I think there's an insurance association who said this bill is punitive. It's going to kill our industry.
Yeah.
I remember being on a Twitter, a Twitter meeting. I forget, a Twitter live. Instagram. I remember being on a Twitter meeting, and someone who worked in manufacturing, was talking about how this finance bill meant that already high taxes were going to become exorbitant, that it was going to affect manufacturing within the country. IT professionals had things to say about the bill. I mean, this was just people of the professional class.
And this included personal taxes as well, eh?
Yeah.
People's taxes, work taxes.
Personal taxes were going to be affected. Personal effects, I believe, things like nappies, diapers rather, menstrual products, like taxes were going to increase even on basics and essentials. So this was something that was affecting everyone. And so people just, it just seemed like every day since the finance bill was announced, there was just like a new outrage of what was contained in the bill. And slowly, you could just hear people had already been angry. People had protested a finance bill from 2023 that got passed. And so there's just this discontent that was building and building online. And, finally people were like, when are we going out? Like, we need to, like, when are we going out?
Go out on the streets.
And
I remember when just before the protests, I know the Kenyan president had been to the States. And I remember reading that he was about to borrow some money from the IMF. So in my mind, I was wondering whether that wasn't part of the deal for him to raise taxes as part of borrowing that amount or not. Did you hear anything along those lines in Kenya?
I mean, that was exactly it. So certainly our perception was that this bill was written actually by the IMF, that it had not really been run through Kenyans, and that, they were the ones who were proposing these punitive taxes, and that politicians were perfectly happy to pass them on to ordinary Kenyans. And part of course, the overall discontent is that as much as the bill specifically was a problem, it was also this idea that in general, that politicians are exempt from bad policies, that they can, loot public coffers, that they can destroy public services, that they and their families do not use. Their children are attending private school when public schools are underfunded. The doctors are striking, but these people can afford to go to private hospitals. These politicians can afford to go to private hospitals or to fly out of the country for medical treatment. So they really just don't care.
Now you've highlighted this the social and political climate.
Yes.
And in terms of political leadership,
yes,
how do you view Kenyan political leadership currently and just before the protest?
I will say, I think we know it's frequently reported in Kenyan media how corrupt politicians are. There's wide public knowledge of who is stealing what and who was involved in what corruption scandal, and we see politicians get involved in these scandals and get away with no repercussions. There's no slap on the wrist. They don't lose their jobs. They're not imprisoned. Their assets are not seized, or, so what we have seen is that essentially politicians in Kenya are a criminal class who are allowed to essentially just freely commit crime and get away with it with no consequences whatsoever.
So they're not serving Kenyans in general, do you think? Or there is some form of development in Kenya, but there's that element of corruption as well?
I think what we have is this specific combination where so going back a little bit to the historical context, we had our first presidents president post-independence, Jomo Kenyatta, from independence until his death in 1978. And then the vice president, Daniel Arap Moi, took over from 1978 until 2002, where he stepped down. So he was in power for 24 years. And then I think in 2002 is a year when Kenyans were extremely hopeful, extremely optimistic, and very united because, in an overwhelming landslide, all politicians had banded together in one party, to run against, the ruling party. And they won. So we had President Mwai Kibaki, and there was certainly quite a bit of controversy under his 2 terms, in the second term especially. But during this decade, we saw a huge amount of economic development, infrastructure development. We saw, old systems that had been run into disrepair revived. We saw new systems implemented. I mean, one of the first things the Kibaki government did when they came to power was provide free primary school education across the country, public education. And this was huge.
Is it still there? This free primary school education, is it still?
I think it's still there, but it's really been kind of run into the ground. And one of the things that people were mentioning a lot on social media is that actually part of the reason for the protest is that people who didn't have access to an education before got an education under the Kibaki regime. I think even things like university became more accessible. So many people found that, they now had access to education where they might not have had before, or it would have been a big struggle for them. And so now we have a much more educated populace who are able to look at this, this finance bill. They're aware of what's going on. They know how, they're media savvy. They don't believe everything politicians tell them. They know how to question things and think critically.
Which is good, which is what's required, right, of citizens.
Exactly. And so, so then after Kibaki, we have Uhuru Kenyatta who comes into power, and we start to see, although processes continue to work, and he did continue with some of the, infrastructure expansion that happened under the Kibaki government, but we do start to see kind of like a rise in corruption, and maybe we see a little bit more like politicians are catering to the West, catering to Western ideas and policies, and so on and so forth. And so people were actually very, were progressively unhappier under the Uhuru government. And I know Uhuru's last term, he was not popular at all.
So they were kind of, as you mentioned, catering to the West. Would you link that maybe to, because I know Uhuru and Ruto were meant to be tried at the international court at some stage? Would that be linked? Because I don't know how they were never tried, right? It just fizzled out, or they were let off, or what happened?
Well, I think that, I forget exactly the details of where the case reached, but it did have to fizzle out because key witnesses disappeared, or were unable to testify. So yes.
Okay. Now, you participated in these protests.
Yes, I did.
Now, how were they coordinated, and what was the role of social media and technology in mobilizing the youth? What was the mobilization process?
Honestly, social media was huge. I think primarily everything was done on social media. Like I said, even the information about this finance bill was spread on social media. I was getting all of my information from places like Twitter and TikTok, or even Instagram. Like I said, professionals were out here kind of, sounding the alarm actually
through social media
about the bill, and they're like, hey, this is beyond.
WhatsApp groups,
we're getting into dangerous territory. I personally don't know that WhatsApp groups.
Okay, it was just
certainly personally, I didn't see much on WhatsApp groups. It was primarily, I think,
your usual social media,
Twitter, TikTok, and somewhat. Actually, I think Instagram was a little bit late. Yes, and I'm sure at some point I'm not on Facebook, but I think some of that must have filtered onto Facebook. So that is where discontent was sparked. This is where things were mobilized. I definitely remember there just being this mood, like we were building up, where even on social media, we realized all we were doing was talking about the finance bill, and it was leaking offline, because one joke was that, you go to like a party and, you're there with your friends, and then the conversation turns to the finance bill. And I remember, because that also happened to me, I remember being at a party and we're like, chit-chatting, and at some point, like, we were really like, all of us were just talking Kenyan politics, and we're just talking about this bill. And, that's also, I think, part of the reason that I wanted to, like I said, complicate the youth narrative, because something that I was noticing is that Kenyans were united again. They were probably as united as in 2002, where across age groups, across socioeconomic class, across ethnic groups, people of all different backgrounds, of all different ages, were just, there was a national fury. There was just this sense of just total anger and fury at the willful ignorance of our politicians in trying to push through what was very obviously and openly an IMF-sponsored bill, regardless of what Kenyans thought or felt.
Or what would the consequences, right?
Yeah, I mean, these bills are open to consultation, and professional groups had provided their feedback on it. But it was going to, it was clear that from the way politicians were talking, they were like, we're going to pass this bill with or without you. We don't care what you think.
Yeah, I know some of I think it's been said that some of our leaders signed these IMF bills without reading the detail.
Yes.
And I know IMF would not act in the interest of Kenyans or any African for that matter.
And this is exactly, and I feel like as ordinary Kenyans, we just saw it as, so our government, our leaders are the ones that have gotten us into this giant debt, with all of these loans. We do not see where the money from these loans has gone. We are not seeing new development on the ground. We're not seeing new roads being built. We're not seeing new hospitals. We're not seeing new schools. Instead of seeing an increase in efficiency in the public service, we're actually seeing services that were efficient becoming worse and worse. We're seeing more corruption. We're seeing that it's harder to just do even very simple things. So we're asking ourselves, okay, you took out these loans supposedly to better this country. We have not seen the impact of these loans. And now we are going to be taxed to pay back these loans that we supposedly took out. That we ordinary Kenyans are going to be burdened both with the debt and with a country that has systems that are not working for us.
Yes. Now, would you say these protests were more organized than previous protests? Were their leaders kind of giving direction to the protests? I know you said they were organic, which would mean maybe they were spontaneous, right?
One of the funny things is, I would say they were more organized, and I think they were more organized because it was by the people for the people. We were very, very invested in trying to change things. And, in the past, protests have been called, usually by, an opposition party leader. But in this case, we're like, no, we are doing this, and we're going to take this burden of educating the people who are not on social media, or the people who are, kind of skeptical about whether or not these protests are going to be effective. In terms of organization, I think within 2 days' notice, I remember, I think so the first protest, I think, was June 18th. That was a Tuesday. And then the next one was Thursday, the 20th of June. And by the Thursday, and then there was a very big one on June 25th. And I remember that within 2 days' notice, by the Thursday, when they realized that we might want some like medics on the ground, doctors arranged to provide medical care. And so we had doctors, and then people decided, to donate medical supplies that might be needed. Like all sorts of people showed up to coordinate, and within 2 days' notice, we basically built the largest hospital in Kenya. Oh yeah. And I mean, on top of that, we had tech people. There was someone who created a finance bill GPT. So you could go into this GPT
and read about the finance
and
bill,
ask whatever questions you wanted to know about the finance bill, and it would respond. Another tech person, created an SSID. So for those who didn't necessarily know how to use a GPT or didn't want to, you could dial a number on your phone, and you, again, same thing. You just ask whatever questions you wanted to know about the finance bill,
and you get answers.
You get those answers. Lawyers were coming together for free to explain sections of the Constitution, of the bill. I mean, so this is very interesting. And I think, business owners were donating supplies. So people came together and we were able to coordinate. And I think, to me, it really just shows the level of resourcefulness that Kenyans have when our government is not squashing us. These are the things, these are the capabilities that Kenyans have. And they're willing to do this for free. They were willing to just do this on their own initiative for, for Kenya, for Kenyans.
So this narrative that it was a youth protest, it involved all Kenyans, but would I be correct in saying it was kind of the youth were the forefront, or everyone was playing a role?
Many people were playing a role, and I think especially because not everyone had the capacity to go out on the streets. So I think maybe that's where the youth led comes from, because I mean,
the youth are energetic and running on the streets. And they're the ones seen on the streets.
They're the ones seen on the streets, but also they're the ones who do not have jobs, or they either don't have a job or they're very underemployed. So they have the time, they have the capacity to go out. They have the freedom, they may not have children, so they may not be as wary of of leaving the kids orphaned behind. But plenty of parents came to protest, actually. There's a number of parents who said, well, I'm here to protest for my kids so that they can have a better future. So but I do think you do have a cocktail. I mean, I don't know if I quite fall into the youth demographic since I'm a millennial, but I mean, I was I didn't have work to go to. I had a lot of energy. I had time to sit on,
Well, you're still young, and the youth, because I'll tell you, in Zimbabwe, the youth minister must be in his 50s.
That sounds like Africa to me. That sounds very right. Sounds,
Now, in terms of the government response, what was the government response like to the protests?
I mean,
and law enforcement.
The government response was, it was this progression. I think at first it was just denial. They were like, "Oh no, we have this bill. It's gonna pass through.
To go through.
It'll pass through just the same way other things have passed through, with or without you." And then I think after denial, it kind of turned. There was a bit of denial. Then there's there was some indifference, denial, and then it kind of starts turning to like contempt of like, oh, these protesters, a famous quote was that, oh, these KFC eating, these Uber riding, iPhone using, kids are coming to protest, but then that actually kind of tells you how angry people were, because generally, generally the middle class has not been a huge part of protests. There've been some members here and there, but I think the perception has usually been that it's usually lower income people who are more disenfranchised, who are, who will go out onto the streets.
Yes.
But I think, the middle class really, really showed up for this.
Yes.
And I think, it's very telling that the government doesn't understand the danger of that. When a country is at the point where people who are relatively comfortable are willing to go to the streets, to protest, then that kind of tells you the level of anger that's happening. So there was contempt, and then actually, sorry, I didn't finish the remainder of your question about the government response. So it kind of went from this, indifference, denial, then this kind of contempt of, we were called treasonous, in a very famous speech. But then it also just turned to brutality. It turned, I think the first couple of protests, we were being tear gassed, and we were peaceful, those tear gassing, there were water cannons, and then, people also just being beaten by the police. And then the third protest, and that was the June 25th one, and that is the date that Kenyans will not forget, is when people breached parliament, and there were snipers, there were guns, like people opened fire and killed a number of protesters. Yeah.
Do you know how many protesters were killed?
So the numbers are unclear because actually there was a protester who was killed first in one of the earlier protests. It was just one, but the 25th, I think, I want to say maybe we started with like a number of 20. But what happened is that either that day or the next, police just went to certain neighborhoods and were just shooting indiscriminately.
Wow.
And we were hearing huge numbers, but then the bodies weren't showing up until later. So a couple of weeks later, so we were like surprised because, people who live, there's a neighborhood called Githurai, where, we were getting reports on social media. And then actually, unfortunately, this is part of, I guess, maybe the government response, but our national telecoms carrier shut down internet access. So people couldn't say what was happening in real time. We didn't, you were trying to log on to Twitter, you couldn't see anything. You were trying to call people, you were trying to send messages, you were unable to do so. And so, you wake up the next day and you hear, okay, huge numbers of people were shot, but there were no bodies. And then a couple of weeks later, outside of a police station in a quarry, bodies were found tied up in bags, and they're still recovering bodies as far as I know. So, so the estimates, I think maybe they're around 50, that we know of for sure. But once you start including some of these bodies that are being found later on in bags, it's, we're talking up to, over 100, or maybe even 200 people. And there have been abductions since then as well. People were being abducted in broad daylight. These are videos you can see on social media because people would take a video and post it. So
look, that was expected. Now, what I don't know is when the shooting started, because I know just after the peaceful protests, I saw the Kenyan president kind of accuse the police commissioner that he was treating the protesters with kid gloves.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I know since then the commissioner is left.
Yep.
Now, when this shooting started, was it during the previous police commissioner, or it was he had changed, he had left the scene?
Actually, I need to remember that timeline.
No, but I saw
because I think because I remember us feeling like we'd gotten a win when the old one left, and then some people who were a little bit more in the know were like, "Oh, this new one is gonna be worse." So I mean, there was brutality under the old one for sure.
But I know the Kenyan president wasn't impressed with the way he handled the protest.
I think it did escalate under the change.
No, it's interesting.
Now, and I think had you asked about whether or not there were any reforms proposed? Or?
Yes. The government response, basically, how they responded and where it ended. I know in terms of explaining the government response. Then brutality happened, and I know at some point. The president withdrew, said he was not going to push the bill. What became of that bill?
I mean, that's what he said, you know, but what we have found is that he's trying to push through the bill through other bills.
Okay.
Yeah. So
in bits and pieces.
In bits and pieces,
Okay.
you know, so now I actually ended up compiling a huge list of other bills that people had been talking about, and they're new ones. There's like a constitutional reform bill that's up right now. There's like, I think there's an agricultural bill up for debate. So there's a large number of, so now piecemeal through other bills, it seems that all of these measures that people were opposing in the finance bill are being
one
pushed
at a
through.
time.
Yeah, you know, and so.
But are Kenyans aware of that?
They are. They are. Because people are continuing to sound the alarm. I think.
But they won't protest. They're not willing to go to the streets currently.
Actually, no. In the last week, there have been protests. So even last week as well, because unfortunately, I'm out of the country right now. But when our old national health insurance fund was rolled over into a new one, and Kenyans were rightfully asking, what is the purpose of creating a new one? Because our perception is that the new fund is just an easier way for resources to be stolen.
Yes.
So people were on the streets protesting last week, and I think they went a couple of times.
Okay.
Yes.
So nothing has changed.
Yes.
And I know Ruto is up for another term, is it?
I mean, he's only halfway through his first term because he was voted in 2022.
So do you think he'll be back in his second term?
I will say this. One of the underlying chants of the protests was Ruto must go. And people are angry enough that there are some people who are saying, excuse me, there's some people who are saying, oh, we'll try to vote him out in 2027. That's the next election. And people are like, no, it's 2024. We cannot afford, like, life is too difficult right now. We cannot afford for him
urgency to go.
There's an urgency for him to go. Yes. And, you know, during the protests, people, people were talking about other protests in which they successfully removed leaders. So I think that was really the hope of Kenyans, is that they really want to see, they want to see the president, but really it's not just the president, it's the entire political class gone, because it is not just, the president is the figurehead. He is the...
When you say the entire political class, are you talking about his party or including
everybody,
opposition?
Including opposition. The opposition have absolutely failed us. The opposition have been bought out. The opposition are just there to, as far as we are concerned, almost everyone, I think there's like a couple of senators maybe that people feel are honest. There's one like from the coast, her name is Crystal Asiga, and it seems like she's someone who has actually done the job of genuinely representing and advocating for Kenyans. But in terms of others, I mean, when we were protesting, one of the other things that we were doing was we were investigating all politicians. We were investigating anyone who voted for the bill, anyone who had anything to say about the protest. So we were going through people's records, and we were listening to people who were speaking up and saying, oh, you know what, this person is a representative in our area, and here's all of the dirt of what they have done. Actually, there's someone, Morara Kibaso Jr., who is going around Kenya looking at development projects and exposing them, where it's like, oh, well, here's a development project that was launched in 2019. It is supposed to be a stadium, but all you have is a plaque, and
nothing has happened.
And you just have like a grass field, and maybe like a pile of old stones or something.
Nothing completed.
Nothing has been completed. And even worse is that there was a moment where President Ruto was going around the country relaunching old projects. So he was going somewhere and he was saying, "Oh, we're gonna,"
it's a new one.
as if it's a new one, to try and fool Kenyans into believing that any kind of development is happening under this government.
Yeah.
And all of the projects, all of the projects that he's supposedly launching predate his government.
Okay.
So this is a real indictment.
But were they running projects? Were they?
No, they weren't.
Or they were.
Yeah, because they hadn't been started. So he could just go and show up and say, "Okay, and now we're gonna get this project started." And it's like, well,
and nothing happened after that.
We have your tweet from 2019,
Yeah.
About how this project was being launched then.
Yeah.
So,
what's the difference now?
What's the difference now?
Yeah.
And it's a little bit embarrassing, because it's kind of like, did you really, Kenyans are angry. We're willing to go and check now. I mean, this guy Morara is traveling to different parts of the country, and he was doing it on his own dime. I think now people are chipping in to help him go around.
Okay.
But he's going and he's like, here is video evidence.
Yeah.
Come and see. This is the development that you were promised that has not happened. So
now let's say people's wishes are granted, that the whole entire political class goes.
Yes.
Wouldn't there be a vacuum left?
Yeah, there would be a vacuum. This is a question that we were, that was constantly being asked. Well, then, what next? Who next? And at this point in time, the movement was very adamant that we are leaders. Although there are some prominent activists, but they themselves have said, like, listen, I'm here to be an activist. I'm really not interested in joining this class of people. We have seen historically that, youth leaders, we have seen them get bought out. We have seen them get positions in government. We've seen people, there are people who I grew up watching on television who are mocking corruption, and now they're the corrupt political officials. They got their turn, they got into government, and then they just turned into the exact people that they were.
No principles at all.
No principles, the exact people that they were mocking. And so this time, we're very wary of anyone that is popping up their head to say, like, oh, I will lead the country, because quite rightly, we actually see, we believe that anyone who is choosing leadership in Kenya is choosing it for the wrong reasons. We would rather pick a person that we feel that we can hold accountable. And so in terms, I think
are Kenyans ready for that? Because that vacuum is, would be worse than
you
Kenyans in a worse position than.
I think
what you're protesting about.
I think this is just my own personal thought. I think we just know that we have to get rid of what is happening right now.
What is the opposition like?
I think
the opposition as well must go, you say?
Yeah, because the opposition are not a true opposition. They're just there to complain that they don't get enough of a chance to be corrupt or to eat, or so I think for us, what our idea is that I think partially even just the act of clearing out the people that are there sends a message. It sends a message that actually we do have some power. So this is what I think the hope is we really do want these protests to be effective, and we do want to get rid of people so that people understand that, like, no, you're not going to get into government and just be corrupt and face no consequences. We will kick you out. And I will say, in terms of what next, in terms of leadership and a vacuum there, there's, and I don't have a lot there, but in terms of what next with the people we have cleared out, I see a clear path. I see a path of jailing these people, of trying these people, of seizing their assets, because these are assets that have been stolen from Kenyan people. These are taxes that have been stolen. These are things that should have been used to develop the country that went off to build somebody's mansion or swimming pool or whatever. Apparently, Kenyan politicians are buying houses overseas in Dubai, which I think should actually be considered treasonous action, because why are you taking public resources to spend in a foreign country? anyways, I'm not a lawyer, so that's just
yeah,
my own thought.
corruption is a big.
So for me, in terms of the what next, I think assets should be seized. I think money should be returned to where it should be returned to. I mean, will these things happen? I don't know, but this is, I would like to see people being jailed. I would like to see people in exile.
Do you have an investigative unit in Kenya that deals with political corruption? Well, it's there, but it's not effective.
It's there, it's not effective. They too are, corrupt or also, or ineffective, or, I mean, pretty much any area of government that maybe kind of is still semi-effective is then kind of really suppressed. Like their efforts are kind of curtailed.
Now,
so yeah.
If I can go back to the president.
Yes.
When he was elected.
Yes.
He sounded promising in terms of the speeches he was making. He sounded very Pan-Africanist, etc.
Yes.
And I believe some people now don't think so, especially with his stance towards Israel. He's causing up to the West. And as you mentioned, the protest came just before or after he had been to the US, etc. And he was, I don't know, in terms of the view Kenyans have of what has happened in West Africa. Do you have a kind of your finger on the pulse of what Kenyans think, what has happened in West Africa?
Yeah, Kenyans have been watching. I think, there's like a moment we were calling it the Jollof Spring, so we were like watching with like a lot of interest, to see some, places like Burkina Faso and is it Mali as well?
Yes, Mali, Niger.
Yeah, Niger, voting in like new fresh leadership or, who are like very vocal about how they're going to cut ties with, colonial ties with France and, so those are things that certainly people, I think, were watching.
Yeah, because I know when the coups happened, Ruto kind of said they were trying to push or threatening military action against those countries. Yeah, that's why I'm saying.
Yeah.
How did the Kenyans view the whole?
I actually, oh wow, I must have been occupied with other things because I don't remember Ruto saying that. I think something.
Because he was talking together with the ECOWAS leadership and the Nigerian president Tinubu and all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just
I'm not what general Kenyans.
I'm not very informed on that front, but I do know. I think. Some people were very hopeful about this president. I was not one of them.
So no, that's fine. Yeah. Now, obviously, you mentioned the finance bill. And other issues like youth unemployment and economic marginalization.
Yes.
As the key drivers of the protests.
Yeah.
Now, in your view, what is the future? Of youth activism in Kenya, do you think?
I mean, as long as these broader political problems aren't solved, there will always be a future for youth activism. As long as you have, underemployed, disenfranchised youth, as long as you have severe economic inequality, you will always have a class of people who...
And in the face of police brutality?
Even in the face of police brutality, because even after all of the deaths and all of the killing, last week people went to the streets. So, I mean, and actually even after some of those deaths, I remember one Sunday, there was like this spontaneous protest. I think maybe that one had been organized a little bit more on TikTok because most of the ones that I attended had been on Twitter, organized on Twitter. And so there was a protest for people who had been killed by the state. So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, we don't want to be killed and we don't want to be shot, but you cannot kill 50 million Kenyans. So we're just going to keep coming out, and you're just, yeah.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point, because I've heard from other countries that usually where there's the police or the military, when there's a critical mass of protesters, they cannot afford to shoot. But if there are few protesters, they can afford, because they know people will just scatter. But shooting, like you say, millions of people or thousands and thousands of people will bring attention to that specific country. Now,
I think it did actually.
Yeah. Now, do you think any change will happen after this protest? Any tangible change, or do you think the government will get its way?
I do. I do think there'll be tangible change. I'm not entirely sure what it'll look like. I think one of the things that the protests did is, I think it just made it clear, because like I said, the first two protests, there were a bunch of people who are resistant, the first one especially, people are like, oh, like you're really going to go out to protest? And I was like, why not? And then they were scared. And the second one, it kind of, more and more people showed up. And so it was very clear that, like, oh, this is real, So that Tuesday, like, I mean, the streets were packed, I think it really helped people to just be more, even for people who weren't able to protest or people who are skeptical, they're now emboldened, even people who really were very hopeful and optimistic about this government, they're now willing to just say, like, look, I've been disappointed. This isn't right. Something needs to change, even if they're not going to go protest, they're more willing to voice their anger and vocalize it, knowing that they're not alone. I think in terms of tangible change, we will see. I really, if
there'll be some kind of impact.
There will be, I think
Kenya will never be the same going forward.
I think so. I think I want to see how things play out, because the government has really, really been very adamant about continuing to just operate as if
nothing happened,
as if they don't need to actually do the work of a government. And like I said, Kenyans are fed up, and maybe there's been a lull in protesting, but like I said, people are back out for the medical bill, for the change in medical insurance. And
well, if it doesn't happen in 2024, we'll wait and see in 2027.
We cannot. I think it's just like, we really just can't afford to wait that long. I think it's just going to keep. I really want to see it, but people are still angry, and it's entirely possible. Actually, something else is just, you're talking about the vacuum of, like, well, if we get rid of these people, who comes in next? I think maybe in this time when these protests have not necessarily been successful, I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who are really trying to organize hard behind the scenes to kind of make sure that the next wave of protests will maybe be more targeted or more protected, or, just to kind of make sure they have more of an impact. So we'll see what happens.
Now,
but it's not over.
In terms of bringing some context, what are the lessons that other African countries going through similar situations as Kenya, what would be your advice for an effective and successful protest? Because protests are constitutional everywhere in Africa, but they're crushed heavily as if they're illegal. Because I know you were not violent. The Kenyan protests were not violent.
They were not.
So what lessons can you
I think I'm not a great person to ask about this because I'm a person, there are people who are organizers on the ground and, who have kind of done this work.
Even from your observations,
so this is
how
just,
you'd rate it as successful. You can say because this happened, etc. And you mentioned numbers.
Yeah. I think really, I mean, numbers is the key, and numbers is just, I think, what I will say is that, the social media spaces that I hang out in tend to lean towards activism.
Okay.
And so a lot of, like I said, a lot of this anger has been building up by people just being vocal and saying their piece and just pointing out and chipping away at this facade of government. And I do think, if there's anyone out there who's, an activist in another African country who is wondering, okay, when will it be our turn? How come, Kenyans were able to do it and we weren't, and so on and so forth. Just kind of keep believing, because if you're telling the truth, then people will see that, people are on your side. Some people are afraid to put themselves out there until they see how, until they see that it's a big enough group that they feel protected. But I do just think that, for years, there are people who have just been saying some of these things over and over again, and it just started to spread and spread and spread because, well, politicians were just getting bolder and bolder and bolder, thinking that there would be no consequences. And so then when things just boiled over, it turns out that you may feel alone as an activist or like you're just a very small group of people, but people are listening. People are listening to you, and they might not be ready to act yet. And I think that can feel very lonely and disheartening, and like you're just exposed out there by yourself. But people are listening, and you might just be surprised at how quickly things can change and how quickly there might be something like a finance bill that just unites everyone. Everyone just says, actually, you know what? We're ready. We're ready. We're ready to fight. We're ready to put ourselves on the line.
And people were prepared for the West.
Yeah. I mean, maybe not some of the younger people, but I'm old enough that, I remember the kind of brutality that you had under the Moi government, so, so I was very much aware that I was taking a personal risk in being out there, but I was okay, I was happy to go out there and support.
No, thank you so much. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Joan.
Well, actually, I did. Just some small things. I did realize when you were talking about the vacuum and how dangerous it can be, you're right. Some people have talked about it. I think, certainly some, feminists have pointed out that if you're not careful, you can just end up with another form of dictator that's,
or warlords,
or even maybe sometimes you get a very well-intentioned person who has their, who has a narrow frame of view and may not necessarily have a wider scope, may not be inclusive in freedom that is, and equity for everyone.
You'd have a benevolent dictator, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And so you just but we understand. I think in terms of, we understand the qualities that we want to see in people in government. But we are wary right now of trying to say, oh, this person or that person, because, our government has been very effective at quashing and co-opting movements. The second a leader emerges, they buy them out or whatever.
So now you've looked at more principles-based leadership rather than personality-based leadership.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, because I still see a lot of Africa are kind of cultish in following personalities.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, so it's a good thing if you say Kenyans have evolved in that regard.
In that regard, I think it's definitely, because we're what we want is a cultural change. Because of course, in the end, fish rots from the head. So when we have like when we had Kibaki in government and he was someone who was trying to fight corruption, he didn't fully stamp it out, but we made a lot of inroads. We made enough inroads that you noticed that if you went to get a public service done, you went to get your passport renewed or so on and so forth, you weren't being asked for bribes anymore, or like people would be reporting if someone asked that, and people were,
so there was progress.
There was progress, there were like some type of consequences, if for corruption. And under this particular president, it's just kind of like, government services kind of came to a standstill as soon as he was elected, because it's just like anywhere you go, you cannot get a single thing done.
And how strong are institutions in Kenya? Government institutions or any other human rights or whatever have you?
Because Kenya is a little bit of a West, there's all these Western interests in Kenya. And in some ways it's part of the problem, but in other ways it kind of partially protects us because it means there are enough powerful eyes on us as a country. I don't know.
Are there powerful eyes, or they just tell the politicians don't rock the boat? Because
I think it's mostly it's mostly don't rock the boat. They're like, hey, don't you know we're trying to mine something here, we're trying to loot these resources, what are you doing, like, by rocking the boat? So I think, I don't know.
And local ownership, is it limited? Do locals own a large piece of the pie in the economy?
I think there's some attempts to try and have things be more locally owned, but then it turns, foreigners will just come and get like a Kenyan to sign on to their board of directors or whatever if they want to run a company, or so there are always ways around these things. It's quite disappointing, to find out how many things you think are Kenyan that are actually not. They're not owned by Kenyans. All of the money is, flows out of Kenya and, flows into bank accounts elsewhere and is not spent in the country or used to develop the country. So,
well, we hope for the best, Joan. That was Joan Wahiga. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much
for being here and sharing your thoughts and your experiences with the Kenyan protests.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It was a real pleasure to be here.
Have a good